Close the door, kill the lights, and come closer. If you listen carefully, right now, through the hum of your electronics and the faint rhythm of your own pulse, you might just catch it. A high, thin whine that shouldn't be there, like a dying frequency caught between two distant stars. It's the sound of the deep ocean trying to send a signal to a machine that can no longer receive it. That sound, that tiny sliver of distortion, is the first warning sign that everything you rely on, steel, code, concrete, and the illusion of safety, is about to melt away. We assume these massive floating cities are invulnerable, sleek shells gliding across the abyss, but I've been inside the walls. I know the darkness that pools beneath the polished surface. Speaking of surfaces, don't look behind you right now. Just focus on my voice. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Drop your city and local time in the comments. Breathe in, breathe out, and follow my voice into the shadows. I never wanted to be a deep-sea engineer. I wanted to build bridges, structures rooted in earth. But the money was on the water, specifically aboard the Argentum Dream, a 75,000-ton cathedral of glass and steel slicing through the unblinking eye of the South Pacific. They called it a luxury liner, a floating resort for 4,000 souls seeking oblivion and champagne. To me, Elias, working the subterranean maze of the engine control room, ECR, it was just a giant, overcomplicated machine demanding constant, weary attention. Our maiden voyage was supposed to be a smooth arc from Honolulu toward the desolate Marquesas, a route chosen for its advertised serenity. But the sea, as any sailor knows, has no regard for marketing brochures. The first crack in the facade appeared 3 days out, near the tail end of the cyclone season. It wasn't a mechanical failure. It was a crisis of information. Captain Velasquez, a man whose face was mapped by 25 years of salt spray and worry, stood hunched over the main bridge display. The atmosphere was thick, less humid than the ECR, but heavier, compressed by dread. The official company briefing from the corporate hub in Panama had been clear. Hurricane Zephyr was tracking north, presenting no threat to our current course. Stay put, the message had commanded. Maintain schedule integrity. Do not alter. But Captain Velasquez was looking at two screens. The first was the corporate telemetry feed, a clean, digital prediction showing Zephyr curving gracefully away. The second was the onboard, independent radar system, cross-referenced with local NOAA buoy data, a ragged, messy spray of red and yellow showing the storm vectoring sharply, violently, right toward our projected position in approximately 90 minutes. Elias, confirm the processing latency on the primary satellite downlink. Velasquez murmured, his voice gritty like sand in the works. I ran the diagnostics. The corporate feed was delayed by a crucial 35 minutes, likely due to routing through multiple distant ground stations before being sanitized and sent back to us. Velasquez's face was stone. He wasn't looking at weather patterns. He was looking at 4,000 unsuspecting people drinking mojitos by the pool, oblivious to the fact that they were steaming directly into the maw of a Category 3 nightmare. The company insists we proceed, sir. Schedule integrity. I repeated the automated message, feeling the icy grip of protocol. Velasquez didn't even look at me. He looked at the vast, featureless blue outside the bridge windows. There is a specific form of human intuition, a grounding fact often forgotten in the age of algorithms. Deep experience rewires the brain. A veteran captain, whose survival depended on reading subtle shifts in the wave pattern and the smell of the air, develops a sensory system superior to any delayed satellite feed. His intuition was screaming. The schedule is irrelevant if the ship is lost, he said, his voice flat. He slammed his fist down, overriding the system lock. Manual command. Hard turn, 90 degrees port. Increase speed by 3 knots. We are running parallel to the projected impact zone. The entire bridge went silent. The officers exchanged nervous glances. We were disobeying a direct, written order that could cost Velasquez his career, his pension, maybe his liberty. But he had made the choice. Human judgment over corporate data. The ship, huge and ponderous, began its slow, grinding turn, leaning slightly into the unexpected shift. For the next hour, we lived in silent, agonizing suspense. The corporate feed still showed clear skies ahead. The passengers, unaware of the internal battle raging on the bridge, complained mildly about the unexpected wind and the slight change in motion. Then, the independent satellite feed finally updated. The color drained from the bridge. Where the projection had shown open water, there was now a swirling, colossal mass of deep crimson and black, the unmistakable eye of Hurricane Zephyr, moving exactly where the old captain's instinct had predicted. It was a 100-knot beast, and we were gliding safely along its massive shoulder, narrowly escaping the gravitational, pulverizing suction of its center. Velasquez had saved us. He had saved the 70,000-ton vessel and all the souls aboard by betting on his gut against the machine. But as I watched the storm rage on the distant screen, I felt a deeper chill. It wasn't relief. It was the realization that our survival was predicated entirely on the defiance of the system we were supposed to trust. If the machine could be so wrong about something as huge as a hurricane, what else was it blind to? That night, alone in the ECR, maintaining the newly established course, I looked at the shimmering, complex networks of fiber optics and processing cores surrounding me. They were designed for perfect control, perfect information. Yet, they were fallible, manipulated, or perhaps simply outmatched. Fear isn't about what we see. It's about what we imagine is watching us from the blind spots. The storm was massive, but predictable. What frightened me was the conceptual realization that maybe, just maybe, the abyss held things that were fundamentally incompatible with the cold logic of silicon chips. I ran my hands over the cold steel housing of the backup radar. This whole ship, I thought, is a speculative concept, a fragile bubble of civilization launched into a void that does not recognize its rules. And tonight, the bubble had almost burst, only saved by one tired man's memory of the sea. The high of successfully dodging Zephyr faded quickly, replaced by the crushing banality of the deep ocean routine. Captain Velasquez was now facing internal inquiries, but the ship was alive, and that was all that mattered to the 4,000 souls who had booked passage through the abyss. We were now traversing the vast, silent heart of the Pacific, the kind of open water where you could sail for weeks and see nothing but the shifting, liquid horizon. The sea was deceptively calm, a plate of polished black glass under a sky that looked too innocent. Down in the ECR, I tried to focus on the rhythmic pulse of the massive diesel engines, the steady hum of power that kept our fragile city afloat. But the incident with the hurricane had shattered my confidence in the technology. We were reliant on a sophisticated network of sensors, radar, and acoustic mapping systems designed to make the sea predictable, manageable. Yet, we had only survived because one man chose to trust the feeling in his ancient bones over the clean output of a multi-million-dollar satellite feed. I was performing a routine diagnostic on the forward hydroacoustic array when the anomaly appeared, or, rather, when it failed to appear. The sea state monitors showed conditions as minimal swell, force 2. The radar was clean, registering only the distant, slow movement of atmospheric clouds. Everything pointed to a perfect night for smooth cruising. I remember thinking about how ridiculous it was, this massive, intricate structure built to withstand oceanic fury, currently gliding through waters calm enough for a canoe. Then, the world ended for a moment. It wasn't a gradual deterioration. There was no rising swell, no wind shift, no change in barometric pressure. It was instantaneous, violent, and deafeningly illogical. The sound was like a colossal hammer striking the very keel of the Argentum Dream, followed immediately by a terrifying, prolonged shudder that ran through the entire length of the ship, twisting the metal frame like a towel being wrung out. We were hit broadside, not by a wave that rose and lifted us, but by a flat, incompressible wall of water that manifested from nowhere and slammed into us with the kinetic energy of a freight train. The lights in the ECR flickered wildly, dancing between full illumination and complete darkness. Alarms shrieked, collision warning, structural stress, breach alerts, a cacophony of digital panic. I was thrown against the main circuit panel, the impact driving the air from my lungs. The whole ship listed hard to starboard, a sickening, impossible tilt that lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but felt like an eternity of downward acceleration. When the ship finally righted itself, settling back into its normal, stable rhythm, the silence that followed the electronic scream was the most visceral sound I had ever heard. It was the silence of widespread, catastrophic shock. I scrambled back to the main console, ignoring the throbbing pain in my ribs. "Status," I yelled into the emergency comms, my voice shaking. "Bridge reports massive structural damage to the starboard decks, mid-aft. Water ingress detected in 3 bulkheads. Casualties confirmed. We need immediate damage control teams on Deck 5 and Deck 6. My eyes were glued to the radar screen. Blank. Completely, infuriatingly blank. There was no signature of any approaching weather event, no sudden disturbance, no large vessel, nothing. The system insisted we were sailing on pristine water. A grounding fact about the ocean is that it routinely defies standard physics. These are called rogue waves or monster waves. They are often steep, short-lived peaks that can reach over 90 feet, sucking energy from the surrounding water. And because they are not part of a coherent wave train and rise too quickly, they frequently pass undetected by standard marine radar, which filters out low-frequency noise. But this wasn't just a rogue wave. This was a manifestation of pure, illogical spite. I ran to the exterior monitors, the cameras mounted low on the hull. The feed showed only the gentle rippling of the ocean's surface, now stained with debris, shards of glass, pieces of furniture, and worse, small splashes of deep crimson. The reports filtering down from above were horrific. Deck 5, the main dining area, had suffered the worst. The massive reinforced windows had exploded inward under the impossible pressure. The wave had been so fast and so powerful that it hadn't just washed over the deck. It had entered the ship, transforming the opulent space into a watery killing zone. A few hours later, in the cold light of the emergency generators, I was helping the cleanup crews on Deck 5, a gruesome, mandated task designed to keep vital personnel involved and silent. The scene was carnage. Overturned tables, shattered crystal, blood smeared across the once pristine white carpet. I found Manager Maya, her face pale, coordinating the silent evacuation of the injured. She pointed toward a quiet, cordoned-off section. "The Petrovs," she whispered, referring to an elderly couple celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary. They had chosen the window seat. They were crushed against the bulkhead. Harold almost lost consciousness, and Dorothy, they had to pull her out from under a collapsing support beam. Both severely injured. They should have died. They were alive, barely, clinging to their lives in the sick bay. The irony was suffocating. 2 people celebrating a lifetime of commitment, almost erased by a single, unseen moment of oceanic malice. The next day, Captain Velasquez, now under even more severe pressure from the corporate office, received the official memo for the accident report. The internal incident file was coded, "Accident due to normal severe weather fluctuation." Normal severe weather. 70,000 tons of steel violently assaulted by an invisible force, for bulkheads taking on water, hundreds injured, and 2 people almost killed, and it was categorized as a bump in the road. This was the terrifying realization. We weren't battling natural forces anymore. We were battling the necessity of denial. The corporation could not afford for their magnificent, state-of-the-art floating city to be vulnerable to ghosts. But I knew the truth. I had seen the radar screen, or the lack thereof. This attack was too precise, too sudden to be random. If the storm was an act of nature that could be tracked, this was something else. This was a speculative concept of dread. The water itself acting with conscious malice, using the cover of calm to deliver a fatal blow. It felt like the ocean had briefly opened a momentary door, a glitch in reality, allowed a portion of the true abyss to impact our vessel, and then closed the door, leaving no trace. We believe in the fortress of steel until the ocean reminds us that we are just a cork, bobbing on an infinitely larger, colder entity. That night, gazing out at the slick, innocent black surface of the water, I reflected that the true danger of the deep is not its size or its power, but its profound capacity for silence and invisibility. The ocean had shown us its contempt for our machines, and that contempt had left deep, irreparable scars on the hull and on the psyche of everyone who saw the devastation. We were far from safe, and the electricity that kept the lights on suddenly felt tenuous, fragile, like a single thread holding us above the crushing darkness. The mood on the Argentum Dream shifted from celebratory to deeply unsettled. The rogue wave incident, officially described as unforeseen turbulence, had stripped away the gloss of the vacation. Passengers walked the decks with a new, nervous caution, their eyes often flicking toward the massive, seamless ocean that surrounded us. Down in the ECR, we were working around the clock, patching systems, rerouting power, and trying to ignore the constant shuddering sound the damaged bulkheads now made. A low, metallic moan that echoed the collective dread. We were now approaching the mid-Atlantic, far from any landmass, suspended between two hemispheres of endless water. This territory, I knew from my engineering background, was notorious for geomagnetic instability. I was running final diagnostics on the main power conduits with Jiao, a 28-year-old electrical engineer whose intelligence was sharper than any tool in the engine room. She was meticulous, driven, and held the entire ship's complex wiring diagram in her head like a personal roadmap. Elias, the main bus load is spiking intermittently, Jiao reported, her brow furrowed over a panel humming with barely contained energy. It's not demand-related. It's dirty power. Something systemic, not local. I glanced at the chronometer. 2:47 a.m. The darkest, most isolated hour. The sky outside was unusually clear, dominated by a cold, vast spray of stars, the kind of immense cosmic tableau that makes you feel both insignificant and terribly exposed. There wasn't a cloud in sight, just clean black space stretching from horizon to zenith. Then, the world changed again, this time not with a physical impact, but with an electronic scream. It wasn't a sound, but a simultaneous absence of sound. All the humming, the vibration, the relentless mechanical pulse that was the lifeblood of the Argentum Dream, vanished. The emergency lights, powered by local battery backups, flickered on, casting a sickly yellow glow over the ECR. The main consoles went black, their thousands of indicator lights dying instantly, leaving behind a field of dead, cold glass. I heard Jiao gasp. EMP, she whispered, the terror absolute in her voice. A massive, untraceable surge. We weren't just experiencing a power outage. We were experiencing systemic electronic death. Something had delivered an electromagnetic pulse powerful enough to cascade through our shielded, redundant systems, frying circuit boards and inducing currents that vaporized fragile microprocessors across the ship. A grounding fact about modern infrastructure, particularly luxury cruise ships, is that they are floating buildings utterly dependent on constant electricity. Power outage doesn't just mean dark cabins. It means loss of propulsion, loss of navigation, loss of communication, loss of climate control, and most terrifyingly, loss of pumping systems that keep the ocean out. Without power, a modern ship is not a safe haven. It's a rapidly deteriorating metal coffin. I ran to the exterior monitor screen, which, miraculously, was still running on a dedicated optical line and a shielded UPS. I managed to call up the bow camera feed just as the event occurred. Hanging in the cloudless sky, directly above the ship, was a single, impossibly bright, silent bolt of lightning, a white-hot pillar descending from nothingness, striking the main comms antenna cluster atop the vessel. The flash was blinding, instantaneous, and gone before the retinal burn faded. It was lightning from a clear sky, a bolt of pure electromagnetic malice delivered directly to the brain of our digital city. For 72 hours, the Argentum Dream was a dead ship drifting in the vast, uncaring void. The darkness was absolute, interrupted only by the desperate, flickering lamps and the growing sound of human fear echoing through the silent hallways. The air conditioning died, and the ship became a sweltering tomb. Food supplies began to spoil. Worse, without the main pumps running, the small amount of water ingress we had sustained from the Rogue Wave incident began to pool slowly, relentlessly. Up on the bridge, the situation was desperate. Captain Velasquez was trying to communicate via the emergency satellite phone, a small, manually powered device. But the signal was weak, intermittent, and the corporate reaction was panicked and useless. We needed propulsion, and we needed pumping immediately. That's where Jiao became the speculative concept of our salvation, the human mind replacing the machine. The auxiliary generators are shielded, but they need a manual start sequence, she explained, her face streaked with sweat and grime, illuminated only by a small, handheld flashlight. The auto start failed. The control system is fried. We have to bypass the main relays and cold start the diesel fuel injectors directly. This was engineering madness. The main generators were colossal, roaring beasts designed to power a small city. Bypassing the safety protocols and starting them manually was a risk of explosion, fire, or irreparable damage. But we had no choice. For the next 8 hours, Jiao lived in the black heart of the engine room. I assisted, holding the flashlight steady, watching her move with the focused intensity of a surgeon operating on a dying patient. She had memorized the archaic, manual override schematics years ago, information deemed obsolete by the modern digital controls. Now, that obsolete knowledge was the only thing standing between 3,700 people and a slow, hot sink into the Pacific. She worked through the deafening heat and the choking smell of stale fuel, her small frame navigating the maze of dead conduits. She used screwdrivers, wrenches, and sheer force of will to manually engage massive, rusted valves and relays that hadn't been touched in years. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime of black silence, I heard it, a deep, shuddering groan, followed by a cough of pressurized air, and then a slow, building roar. The backup generator caught. The entire ship didn't light up instantly. The power came back in stages, a slow, agonizing resurgence. But the pumps kicked in. The navigation systems blinked back to life. The ventilation fans began to turn, pushing out the stagnant air. We had survived the darkness. Stumbling back to the ECR, exhausted and coated in grease, I watched Jiao collapse onto a stool, clutching her flashlight like a talisman. "We were dead," she whispered, her eyes wide with lingering horror. A single anomaly. If I hadn't known the manual configuration by heart, we'd be sinking now. A reflective thought surfaced, cold and sharp. We build our civilizations on layers of complex redundancy, assuming that technology protects us. But the deeper we delve into the digital age, the more we rely on fragile code and electricity. The ocean doesn't care about our firewalls or our backups. It only cares about simple physics, gravity, buoyancy, and the swift, devastating power of a focused electrical charge. That perfect, cloudless sky had delivered a targeted strike, turning our modern marvel into a silent, helpless monument to our own digital dependence. We had faced a storm, an invisible wave, and now, lightning from the void. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me far more than the Arctic had chilled the Nordic princess, that the sea was not acting randomly. It was learning how to dismantle our systems, one targeted weakness at a time. And we had 3,000 more miles of open water to cover. The ship was running on raw nerves and Zhao's heroic, greasy fix. The power was stable, but fragile, the air thick with the smell of ozone and burnt insulation, the lingering stench of near death. The corporate office had stopped demanding immediate updates, settling instead into a grim silence, perhaps hoping the Argentum Dream would simply vanish and solve their PR problem. We had crossed into an area of the Pacific known historically for its deep, almost unfathomable trenches. The kind of water that seems to absorb light and sound, promising absolute isolation. I was back in the ECR, monitoring the hydroacoustic arrays. These sensitive underwater microphones are the ears of the vessel, essential for mapping the unseen depths, listening for geological shifts, or tracking marine life. A grounding fact of deep-sea navigation is that visual mapping, sonar/radar, only goes so far. The true secrets of the deep are revealed through passive listening. The sea was again unnaturally still, the surface flat and slick. But I felt the shift long before I saw it. The air temperature dropped 10 degrees in 5 minutes, and the pressure seemed to press in on the metal hull, making the residual groans from the rogue wave damage sound louder, more mournful. Then it arrived. It wasn't a bank of fog. It was a wall, thick, heavy, and impossibly white, like cotton compressed by tremendous gravity. It didn't drift in. It enveloped the ship in a matter of seconds, stealing the horizon and every reference point. Visibility went to zero, a crushing, suffocating blanket of moisture and cold. Up on the bridge, panic was already setting in. Radar is useless. We have nothing but white noise. Captain Velasquez's voice crackled over the internal comms. The reflection is too dense, scattering the signal. It's like sailing through milk. Down below, the loss of sight didn't immediately worry me. We had the acoustics. But then, the primary sonar array went silent, too, not due to power failure, but due to signal attenuation. The fog, or whatever constituted the air in this immediate region, was absorbing or deflecting all our outward-facing sensory input. We were blind and deaf on the surface, but the hydrophones were still listening to the abyss. My fingers flew across the console, isolating the low-frequency channels. What I heard made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. It wasn't the sound of the ocean, the familiar rhythmic crunch of crustaceans, or the distant rush of deep currents. It was a sound I had only heard recordings of, the low, resonant, almost orchestral calls of massive whales. But these were wrong. They weren't meandering calls for mating or feeding. They were structured. "Elias, what the hell is that?" Zhao whispered, leaning over my shoulder, holding a trembling flashlight. I ran the sound through the pattern recognition matrix. The output was chilling. The acoustic calls were highly complex, repeating in sequences that defied natural randomness. They were synchronized, mathematically ordered, pulsing in time with the ship's own propeller rhythm. It wasn't communication, it was organization. It felt like a deep, ancient voice performing a countdown. This was the terrifying speculative concept that bloomed in the dark. The fog was not weather, it was camouflage. And the sounds weren't whales, they were signals, instructions being delivered to something vast and profoundly intelligent, something that understood acoustics and math better than we understood our own technology. "Captain, you need to hear this." I keyed the comms, pushing the live hydrophone feed up to the bridge. A moment of static, then Velasquez's voice, raw with alarm. "Those patterns, they're too regular. It's like a cipher. They're tracking us, Elias. They aren't tracking us, Captain, I corrected, staring at the complex, rising frequency graph. They're enclosing us. The hydrophones indicate that the source of the sound is forming a huge perimeter, something massive, surrounding our vessel, just beneath the fog line. It felt like the whole ship was inside the mouth of a monstrous, unseen creature, and the acoustic signals were the contraction of its jaw muscles. I remembered the rogue wave, the targeted, illogical strike, and the lightning, the perfect, cloudless ambush. The ocean was not relying on chance anymore. It was employing strategy. It was using the fog to create an acoustic shadow, trapping us in a silent world so that whatever lurked beneath could move unhindered. The ship was still moving forward, slicing blindly through the suffocating white. Every instinct screamed that we were steaming directly into a pre-laid trap. Captain, the synchronized pulsing is intensifying, I yelled, watching the frequency lines peak violently. Whatever is making those calls is moving fast, rising vertically directly beneath our current path. On the bridge, Captain Velasquez made the second impossible decision of the voyage, an act of sheer, desperate faith in the intangible. His screens were white noise. His radar was blind. He had only the frantic, mathematical songs of the deep and the lingering terror of the hurricane override. Emergency maneuver. Helm hard to starboard. Full rudder. Velasquez commanded. Kill the main propulsion. Slow, slow, slow. We need maximum maneuverability now. The ship responded, shuddering as the massive engines throttled down, their inertia fighting the turn. We leaned hard into the movement, the thick fog seeming to press against the superstructure, resisting the shift. For perhaps 30 long seconds, the Argentum Dream crawled through the soup, changing its trajectory by perhaps 75 degrees. Then, the hydrophones abruptly cut out, replaced by a deep, resonant thrum that bypassed sound entirely and vibrated directly through the steel hull into our bones. I looked up at the exterior cameras, trying desperately to punch through the fog, to see what the acoustic array had warned us about. A flicker, a break in the seamless white curtain, right where we would have been sailing had Captain Velasquez not made the emergency turn. For a single, agonizing moment, the fog parted, and I saw it. It wasn't a rock formation. It wasn't a submersible or a colossal squid. It was a shape of monumental, terrifying simplicity. Something colossal, black, and monolithic, rising vertically out of the crushing depths. It looked less like a creature and more like a slab of ancient, living obsidian, impossibly huge, dripping the cold black water of the abyss. It rose, stalled for a moment in the air, its surface catching the faint emergency lights of the ship, reflecting nothing, absorbing everything. It wasn't just big, it was spatial. It occupied the exact, specific position we had abandoned moments before, and it was so enormous that if we had continued on our original course, we wouldn't have struck it. We would have simply merged with it, crushed instantly between its mass and the waterline. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the thing submerged, dragging the cold water after it, and the fog rolled back in, sealing the world shut. The bridge was silent. The deep thrumming faded, and the hydrophones returned to the sound of silent water. My hands were shaking violently on the control panel. We had been hunted, stalked by something that used the physics of the sea to render us obsolete. The complexity of the whale's song, the synthetic pattern, the perfectly executed trap using the fog. This was proof of malice, or at least, of a profound and utterly alien form of intelligence. A reflective thought. We pride ourselves on navigating and conquering the planet based on our 5 weak senses and the technology we create to extend them. But what terror lurks in the realm of the senses we don't possess? What if the ocean is full of entities that communicate using mathematical structures, operate in acoustic shadows, and perceive our ship not as a vessel, but as a temporary, noisy disruption? We were safe, again, by the hair's breadth of human instinct overriding computerized blindness. But the price of safety was the complete loss of our sanity, knowing that something that immense and ancient was still out there, hiding in the perpetual white gloom, waiting for its chance. We had merely dodged a bullet from a hunter we couldn't see. The Argentum Dream was now a ghost ship sailing through perpetual twilight. We had survived the hurricane override, the invisible rogue wave, the EMP lightning strike, and the predatory fog. Every incident had chipped away at the ship's physical integrity and, more importantly, at the crew's psychological resilience. The atmosphere was thick with exhaustion and the chilling realization that our enemies were not random acts of nature, but targeted strikes of increasing sophistication. We were nearing the Arctic Circle, pushing far north in a desperate attempt to use the remote, less-traveled waterways to reach a major port for comprehensive repairs. The sea had grown frigid, the air sharp and metallic. This was the territory of the ultimate, immutable law, physics. The morning dawned gray and ominous. The sky was an endless ceiling of slate, and the gentle drizzle that began around 6 a.m. felt less like precipitation and more like liquid ice. A grounding fact of physics in extreme cold is the phenomenon of ice accretion. Freezing rain and mist at specific temperatures, near or slightly below freezing, combine with the wind chill factor to deposit layer after layer of ice onto any exposed surface. It sounds trivial, but on a ship the size of the Argentum Dream, this process, unchecked, can be rapidly catastrophic. As the hours passed, the drizzle intensified into a hard, wind-driven freezing rain. I was on the comms with Chief Engineer Kirov, a grim man whose Russian ancestry seemed to have prepared him perfectly for this battle with the cold. Elias, we are accumulating mass at an exponential rate. Kirov's voice was strained, thick with urgency. The decks, the railings, the superstructure, it's all being entombed in a transparent sarcophagus. We have already gained several hundred tons. I looked at the external thermal monitors. The image showed massive, heavy deposits forming rapidly on the upper decks and rigging. The ship was slowly, relentlessly being weighed down by its own shield of ice. The crucial problem was not the weight itself, but the distribution. The ice was accumulating high up, on the antennas, the massive ventilation stacks, the top decks, and the lifeboats. This was raising the ship's center of gravity. By early afternoon, the list began. It was subtle at first, a barely perceptible cant to port, but it steadily worsened, reaching 5 degrees, then 7. Passengers, already traumatized, began to panic as the floor beneath them literally began to slope. Everything that wasn't bolted down slid across the cabins and hallways. In the ECR, the angle made walking an exercise in constant, grinding effort. The ship was listing severely, perhaps 12 degrees, then 15. The air filled with the creak and strain of the hull, metal protesting under the stress of an altered center of mass. Kirov, what's the projection? I demanded, hanging onto a rail. If the ice continues to accumulate at this rate, we have maybe 3, 4 hours before the listing passes the point of no return. We will capsize, Elias. Gravity always wins in the end. We had faced intelligence, electricity, and water pressure, but now we faced the brute, indifferent law of mass. The speculative concept required for salvation was a desperate act of engineered self-harm. Kirov proposed a radical solution, one that defied the very nature of a luxury liner. We must lower the center of gravity instantly. We need to flood the lowest, widest compartments immediately. Ballast alone isn't enough. We must sacrifice the entertainment decks. This was madness. To intentionally flood the high-end zones, the main theater, the spa, the massive central atrium, to bring the center of gravity down. It meant massive, irreparable damage to the vessel, financial ruin for the company, and the permanent destruction of what remained of the passengers' illusion of safety. but it was the only way. Kirov ordered the engineering teams to begin the controlled, rapid flooding of the designated areas on Deck 2. Meanwhile, the evacuation orders for the affected zones were issued. I watched the live security feed of the lower decks as the chief engineer's commands were executed. The massive steel hatches designed for maintenance were sealed, and the high-pressure sea valves were opened. Water, the very element that had been trying to destroy us, was now our desperate tool of salvation. The Nakamuras, a family celebrating their daughter Serenity's 16th birthday, had rented one of the opulent, low-level suites near the grand atrium. They were trapped briefly in their cabin. The emergency alarm shrieked, followed by the terrifying sound of water rushing into the nearby hallway. I saw the footage. The father, Nakamura-san, shoving his wife and terrified daughter out the door just as the first floodgate burst. They scrambled through the rapidly deepening, freezing water, Serenity clutching a dripping, ruined birthday cake. The family celebration abruptly transformed into a freezing, desperate sprint for survival on the upper decks. They had to abandon their cabin, their belongings, and the last remnants of normalcy to the rapidly rising tide. The deliberate flooding worked. Over an agonizing hour, as thousands of tons of sea water rushed into the pre-selected sacrificial zones, the ship's center of gravity dropped sharply. Slowly, groaning in metallic protest, the Argentum Dream began to stabilize, pulling back from the brink, settling into a severe but manageable 5-degree list. We were saved, but we were a ruin. The lower decks were a freezing, salt-water-soaked wreckage. The illusion of the 5-star experience was gone, replaced by the grim reality of emergency blankets, cold rations, and the ever-present, terrifying slope of the floor. That night, monitoring the ongoing battle against the accumulating ice, I felt a deep, chilling reflection. We build these luxury vessels as symbols of human control over the elements, places where nature is merely a pretty backdrop for a lavish existence. But the deeper truth, confirmed tonight, is that physics is inescapable. The sea, the cold, and gravity are indifferent forces that do not care about 5-star ratings or birthday celebrations. They simply operate. We had bought time, but at a terrible cost. We had sacrificed massive sections of the ship to remain afloat, but the systems were now critically strained. And somewhere, hidden in the shadows of the compromised engine room, a small, subtle pressure gauge was beginning to creep, unnoticed amidst the larger catastrophic failures. The darkness was not finished with us. We had survived the external threats only to become desperately vulnerable to the internal ones, the failures of design, maintenance, and human oversight. The Argentum Dream was a wreck, but it was still floating. We had bypassed the rogue wave, restored power, escaped the Leviathan, and countered the devastating ice accretion by intentionally flooding half the ship. We were limping toward Bermuda, navigating on auxiliary power, guided by the grim determination of Captain Velasquez and the genius of Jiao. The internal systems, however, were suffering catastrophic cascade failures. The intentional flooding had caused short circuits, ruptured conduits, and massive strain on the remaining infrastructure. Everything was operating at 110% capacity, held together by sheer willpower and duct tape. My current post was in the damaged, partially functional aft section of the ECR, monitoring the auxiliary life support and power routing. The air was thick with humidity, the lingering smell of burnt plastic, and the acrid tang of sea salt. A grounding fact about industrial vessels is their massive, complex logistical systems, particularly the galley. A ship catering to thousands requires the infrastructure of a small factory, including industrial-grade gas lines for cooking. These systems are under immense pressure, and even the smallest maintenance delay can turn a kitchen into a kinetic weapon. It was 3:42 a.m., the hour of the deep watch, when the ship is supposed to be most silent. Suddenly, a sound ripped through the hull, a percussive blast of shocking finality that made the whole damaged superstructure jump. It was not the sound of water or ice or a wave. It was the sound of concentrated chemical violence. The main galley, situated 2 decks above us, had exploded. The seismic shock wave knocked out the already fragile emergency lighting, plunging the ECR into complete, suffocating darkness again. I could hear the immediate shriek of alarms, but they were distant, muffled by the new, terrifying noise of rushing water, tearing metal, and screaming. The cause was immediately clear to us in the engineering department. The main industrial propane line, severely stressed by the cascading systemic failures and, I knew deep down, ignored due to corporate cost-cutting measures, had ruptured at a faulty pressure valve. The resulting gas buildup, ignited by a pilot light, had vaporized the entire galley complex. I reached the scene minutes later, navigating through smoke and steam-filled hallways. The area that had once been the shimmering, spotless heart of the ship's 5-star cuisine was now a tangled ruin. The explosion had ripped through multiple compartments, blowing out doors and buckling bulkheads. Chef Antoine, a massive 61-year-old man who ruled his kitchen with a fierce, calm authority, was already organizing the carnage. Alongside him was Maya, the operations manager, her face covered in soot, radiating ferocious calm. They had instantly become a fire and rescue unit. Antoine was directing survivors, pulling the injured kitchen staff from the smoking wreckage. Maya was coordinating the rapid containment of the fire, using emergency extinguishers and manually sealing off ruptured steam and gas lines. We had lost the galley, the essential system that fed the city. But the immediate, terrifying failure was something much smaller, something far more degrading. The force of the explosion had cascaded through the adjacent utility conduits, impacting the least glamorous but most vital system, the sewage treatment plant. Within the hour, the unimaginable began. The primary pump failed due to electrical surge and ruptured pipes. The entire sewage system, the dark, septic underbelly of our luxury city, began to fail catastrophically. The sewage, the feces, and the biological waste of 4,000 people, unable to be processed or pumped out, began to back up. Not just in the utility shafts, but into the passenger decks, pushing through ruptured pipes, overflowing toilets, and venting through the climate control systems that were struggling to function after the EMP incident. A sickening, biological tide began to creep through the luxury cabins and hallways. I was tasked with assisting Clark, an environmental engineer and passenger who, by chance, specialized in fluid dynamics. He was working shoulder to shoulder with the remaining crew, his face a mask of disgust and professional urgency. "It's a complete collapse of the main filtration loop," Clark yelled over the stench and the sloshing sound of the rising filth. "The methane buildup alone is a hazard. We're facing a biological disaster if we don't restore primary pumping." This was the final, absolute indignity. Having faced the mythological horrors of the sea, we were now drowning in our own human waste. The air in the lower decks became toxic with methane gas and pathogenic bacteria. Within hours, hundreds of passengers and crew began to suffer from acute gastroenteritis and debilitating infections. Our city was rotting from the inside out. Clark and I worked in the sickening, contaminated darkness, using portable lights, wading through knee-deep effluent. He directed the crew in bypassing the fried main pump, setting up a temporary, jury-rigged gravity feed and a small, manually diverted auxiliary pump. It was a primitive fix, a concession that our high-tech solutions had failed. We were forcing the ship's most basic systems to operate in a manner they were never designed for, simply to prevent mass illness and total systemic failure. By dawn, the immediate flow had been stopped, but the damage was done. The Argentum Dream had to make an emergency port call in Bermuda, not for structural damage, but for public health. As the ship finally slid into the docks of Bermuda, the sight was surreal. A massive, beautiful vessel, listing severely, ice still clinging to its rigging, smelling faintly of sewage and smoke, covered in the visible, greasy grime of the voyage. We were towed to the main yard and docked for what would be 3 months of grueling, costly repair. But the final, psychological blow was yet to come. I was down in the ECR, supervising the final shutdown sequence, when Jiao discovered the last, subtle electronic ghost of the journey. She found a critical software anomaly in the main ship controls, an errant line of code installed during a maintenance update months earlier. This single, misplaced line of code hadn't affected the propulsion or the navigation. It had subtly corrupted the elevator sequencing. At the exact moment of the gas line explosion and the sewage collapse, the software error had executed a command that simultaneously locked, deventilated, and severed communication for all 16 of the ship's luxury elevators. They had all stopped dead, suspended between floors. 6 separate groups of people, including the injured Petrovs, finally evacuated from the sick bay and heading toward the staging area, and a young couple celebrating their honeymoon, were locked into those hanging steel boxes. No air, no light, no communication. They were trapped for 3, 5, even 6 hours, their lives draining away slowly as the air grew thin. A reflective thought hit me with the force of a physical blow. We survived the hurricanes, the leviathans, and the ice. But the final, most devastating threats were entirely homegrown. A faulty valve, a collapsed pump, and one single, invisible line of corrupted code. Eliza and Carson, 2 brave, desperate technicians, had to physically cut into the elevator walls using portable plasma torches to reach the suffocating passengers. They saved them, but the fear, the slow, creeping horror of CO2 asphyxiation in a hanging coffin, was a terror that no luxury brochure could ever erase. The common theme of this descent into the midnight abyss was clear. The Argentum Dream was a floating city, utterly dependent on technology, people, and nature. When just one small link broke, be it wrong data, faulty software, cost-cutting maintenance, or a targeted strike from the deep, the whole system collapsed in minutes, exposing the fragility of our reliance on code and steel. The passengers saw the lights, the pools, the buffet. But we, the crew, the engineers, faced the real darkness under that glamorous surface, learning that the true horrors are often not the massive, visible monsters, but the small, invisible failures lurking in the system. The blast had taken the glamour, the hygiene, and the immediate capacity for life support. The Argentum Dream was no longer a cruise ship. It was a mobile vector for disease, listing, damaged, and slowly filling with the collective filth of its inhabitants. I arrived at the edge of the destroyed galley complex. The heat was immense, a mix of residual fire and steam from ruptured water pipes. Chef Antoine and manager Maya, performing impossible feats of crisis management, had contained the fire, turning the entire zone into a smoking, drenched ruin. We had no working kitchen, no organized system for feeding the thousands, only the raw, immediate terror of combustion. But the immediate threat was not fire. It was the biological rot spreading from below. A grounding fact about confined communities is the speed at which sanitation failure leads to systemic collapse. The methane gas building up from the overwhelmed, ruptured sewage conduits was not just flammable. It was an invisible, odorless killer, and the pathogenic bacteria blossoming in the rising tide of effluent posed an acute, immediate public health disaster. "We need help in the utility shafts," a voice screamed over the comms. "Deck 3 is flooded. It's backing up into the ventilation shafts." I found Clark, the environmental engineer, wading through the nightmare in a makeshift hazmat suit cobbled together from rain gear and plastic sheeting. The smell was beyond description, a dense, sickening miasma of decay, methane, and brine. It was the scent of a collapsing civilization. The main transfer pump is completely seized, Clark shouted, pointing a flashlight at a colossal, fouled piece of machinery. It's not just the gas. The pressure is causing leaks directly into the potable water system lines. We have hours, maybe less, before mass contagion. We have to bypass it, Elias. We have to force the flow out, even if it's clumsy. For the next 4 hours, we performed the most humiliating, visceral engineering task of my life. Stripped of high-tech solutions, we were reduced to cavemen battling the inevitable. We used manual levers, crowbars, and emergency auxiliary pumps designed for localized flooding, rerouting the vast, septic output of the ship through lines never intended for such sustained volume. It was a victory of brute force and desperate knowledge over mechanical failure, a triumph of necessity over dignity. We managed to stabilize the crisis, forcing the waste back toward the deep-sea outflow where, in a terrible irony, it joined the very abyss that had been trying to swallow us whole. The ship was saved from biological disaster, but the psychological scars were now absolute. The guests were forced to endure freezing, listing halls that reeked of rot and smoke. The illusion of luxury was utterly, finally shattered. It was during this cleanup, amidst the grime and the exhaustion, that Jiao made the chilling discovery that contextualized all the preceding failures. She was running a low-level diagnostic on the command interface network, trying to trace the surge that killed the sewage pump. She found it, not in a blown fuse or a power spike, but in the deeper architecture of the ship's primary control software, updated during a routine dry docking months earlier. "Elias, look at this," she said, her voice hollow. "This line. It's a subroutine for the main elevator controller sequence. A single, redundant command, a forced shutdown trigger programmed to execute under specific, high-stress conditions." She had found the ultimate, insidious failure, a single, bad line of code, introduced accidentally or maliciously during a cost-cutting, rushed software patch. This single line acted as a deadly, sleeping speculative concept. It was waiting for a massive system jolt, like the gas explosion, to execute its unintended command. And it did. At 3:42 a.m., when the galley exploded, the power surge hit the system, triggering the corrupted elevator subroutine. 16 elevators, spanning all decks, simultaneously locked their doors, shut down ventilation, and severed their communication links. The ship was still floating, but 16 small, steel boxes had become hanging coffins. The terror was surgical in its precision. 6 groups of people were trapped, some for 3, some for 5 hours, in the dark, hot, airless confines of the shafts. Among them were the Petrovs, the elderly couple who had survived the rogue wave, now trapped on their slow journey to the sick bay, their 50th anniversary ending in a suffocating cage. We could hear their panicked, desperate pounding, muffled and distorted, coming from inside the walls. The emergency systems were fried. There was no internal access panel, and the code lock was impervious. Technician Carson and staff member Elias, operating under flashlights, became our last hope. They were forced into the tight, greasy confines of the maintenance shafts, armed only with portable plasma cutters, tools designed for metal fabrication, not human rescue. The sight, relayed by their helmet cameras, was horrifying. The slow, painstaking process of cutting through the thick steel walls of the elevator car, the air inside choked with CO2, the frantic faces staring out through the widening gap of the cut. They had to cut into the first elevator to save the Petrovs, the elderly woman already slipping into unconsciousness. They cut into the 5th to reach the young couple, whose honeymoon had become a protracted death sentence. Carson and Eliza worked until their gloves melted, until their arms ached, until the air felt too thin for their own lungs, managing to pull all 6 groups out of the steel traps. It was a miracle of human persistence over digital failure. We finally limped into the port of Bermuda. The sight was surreal. The Argentum Dream, listing dramatically, patched with crude repairs, streaked with rust and grime, its upper decks still frosted with Arctic ice, and an inescapable, faint smell of burnt gas and effluent lingering in the air. We had survived every external and internal threat the ocean could throw at us, only to be ultimately humbled by faulty engineering, corporate negligence, and one single, invisible line of corrupted code. A reflective thought concluded my long watch. The grand lie of the modern age is that complex technology equals safety. We build floating palaces designed to isolate us from the harsh realities of the sea, only to find that the very complexity of the machinery creates infinitely more vulnerabilities than the wild ocean ever did. The darkness isn't just in the deep trenches, the ancient monsters, or the sudden storms. It's in the $5 component that fails, the delayed maintenance report, and the single, invisible flaw in the software update. The crew, the engineers, we are the only thing standing between the illusion of the floating city and the absolute, immediate truth of the abyss. We were towed away from the main cruise terminals, away from the tourists, and anchored in the maintenance yard, where the Argentum Dream would sit, a monument to the fragility of human endeavor, for 3 long months. The morning light filtering through the grime-streaked windows of the Isar didn't bring comfort. It only illuminated the vast, greasy ruin we now inhabited. The constant vibration of the auxiliary pumps and the whine of the ventilators were the only sounds remaining, a tired, exhausted rhythm replacing the powerful roar of the main engines. I walked the deserted maintenance decks one last time before stepping onto the solid concrete of the dock, a ground so firm it felt unreal after months of perpetual motion and perilous listing. The air here smelled of diesel and salt, clean and honest, untainted by the complex, insidious rot of the Argentum Dream. Above, the huge vessel sat like a crippled beast, its hull scarred, its lifeboats frozen to the davits, its surface reflecting the rising sun not with glamour, but with the weary sheen of salvaged metal. We had faced the physical wrath of the sea, the 100-knot winds, the 90-foot rogue wave. We had survived the calculated intelligence of the deep, the EMP strike from a cloudless sky, the massive, silent shadow lurking beneath the engineered fog. And finally, we had endured the insidious self-destruction of human error and corporate denial, the exploding gas line, the rising filth, the suspended, terrifying agony of the elevator shafts. Yet, despite the definitive end of the journey, despite the fact that the massive hulk of steel was now bolted securely to the dry dock, one question remained suspended in the sterile morning air, cold and unanswered. Was the series of increasingly specific failures, the lightning strike on the comms antenna, the mathematical organization of the fog calls, simply a string of terrible, unlikely coincidences, amplified by our own vulnerabilities? Or was there a singular, cold intelligence in the deep, a restless spirit of the void, that had learned our language, studied our defenses, and then executed a precise, targeted campaign to dismantle our technological